Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I always love to come to these events because people like you are the people out there who are changing things. So it's always a lot more fun to talk to you because it's of the impact that you can have. I'm here today to talk about, I guess it'll click up a second. I'm here today to talk about the role of women in the economy and what does it mean, right? We talk a lot about inclusion as a good idea, but what are the numbers behind it, and what does it actually mean in terms of society overall, our economy, the companies we create? Why does it matter? I'd just like to start with a couple numbers. So this number, 53%, any guesses what it is? It's actually the number, you guys are close, it's actually the number of women in our sort of large corporations, if you look at Fortune 500 large corporations, that start, right, at the entry-level positions. So in the United States, in entry-level positions in large corporations, in fact, women are coming in the pipeline at above 50%, roughly the ratio of women graduating from college and getting degrees, who are again in the majority. Any guess what this number is? Yeah, it's a number of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies in the United States. So what we're seeing in the United States is that actually women are entering the workforce. They are entering into high-end companies. They're starting off on the right track. And something happens between when they start and when people get to the top. And I think this is the United States numbers, and as we'll look globally, we'll see that, in fact, the United States is one of the leaders in the world, and our numbers look like this. So this is the benchmark of good for today, right? And I don't know how good any of us all feel about that number. Anyone feel good about that number? So today, I thought I'd talk about a couple of things. First of all, why does it really matter? What's the case for change? And why does it matter not just for women, but why does it matter to our economy and to our society and to our companies? Where do we stand? And what are the barriers? What is it that makes it go from 53% to 3% as you go up the ranks? And what can we actually do to begin to change it? So I work as they said, I help lead part of our economic research at McKinsey. I think about the economy all the time, what drives job growth, what actually matters. And if you just sort of took the US economy and you said, from 1970, when women really started to enter the workforce en masse, what is the economic impact of that? Right, so if you look at the economic growth and what were the drivers of economic growth from 1970 to today, there are a whole lot of factors, right? There are a lot of things that drove productivity in our economy, things like computers and cell phones and all of these things. But if you just said, what's the role of just women entering? About a quarter of the growth that we've seen is just that women entered the workforce, right? That difference. I mean, it's a huge economic tide and a huge economic wave in terms of growth. And if you look forward, right, the numbers are, you know, if you brought women in and unlocked some of the barriers, right, it would increase growth in the United States. Could increase US GDP by another 9%. And in Europe, it's about 12 or 13%, and in many of the Asian countries, it's much, much more, right? So a real potential when people are talking about what's going to drive economic growth, well, you know, figure out how to get women into the economy, and I think diversity in general into the economy actually open up a lot of economic engines. Going forward, it's going to be even more important, right? If you look at economic growth, increasingly lots of jobs are getting automated. They've turned into computer programs as opposed to people. And you sort of say, how are jobs created today? Well, in the United States, for example, over the last 10 years, 85% of net new job creation has been for high-skilled workers, right? So people who roughly have some kind of tertiary education, associate degrees, BA degrees, and above, and you sort of say, what's going to drive growth going forward? It's a lot of those high-skilled jobs that are actually going to drive the growth, create the companies, and create the opportunities that drive that growth. And you say, globally, how many of those high-skilled workers do we need, and what will it mean for growth? And if you just look at the economy as a global percentage, if we keep women at the same ratios of the workforce that they are today, we're going to have a gap of about 40 million high-skilled jobs that are not going to get filled, that we need to fill to grow the economy. So one of the biggest breaks in the economy is we don't have enough of those workers if you brought in women at the rates and kept them and retained them at the same rate, it would actually basically fill the gap. So one of the best antidotes for stopping that break in the global economy and global growth is actually diversity, inclusion, and bringing women in, right? So that's one of the big solutions. And I think it's important to remember that when you think about it. This isn't just about, isn't it nice that we bring women into the workforce? It's actually a really important driver of our economy and prosperity and opportunity for the whole economy, for everyone. When you take it to the company level, it's actually pretty interesting too. Now these numbers are correlations, right? They sort of say, they're not causations, they're not saying women drove this, but when you look at companies that actually have a couple of women in the executive management team perform better than companies that don't. Now you can't say it's just because those women are there, but I think what you can say is that companies that have figured out how to make the most of all of their talent, not just the male 50% of their talent, actually have figured out how to get more out of that talent, and they've learned how to figure out how to perform better, right? They're actually thinking about how do they bring talent into the workforce and into their companies, how do they develop them and how do they grow them. That's actually a really important indicator of profitability longer term. And when you think about what companies need to move forward, as you know, we're going through enormous amounts of economic changes, global changes, all the things that are affecting our companies as they're trying to reinvent. When we stand back and say, what is it that's going to actually help those companies reinvent? What are those characteristics and features of the talent and workforce that actually do it? It's pretty interesting. So at McKinsey, we have a benchmark database of employee engagement and talent performance called our Organizational Health Index. And we have benchmarked more than 3,000 companies and more than 1 million employees over the last 10 years. So we have really good data. And if you ask managers, what are the factors that help you better prepare for the future, right? To do the things not the things you're doing today, but the things you're going to need to do to survive, they say, well, there's this list of leadership characteristics. And then you say, well, which gender is better at these leadership characteristics or is more likely to embrace them? You realize that more than half of those leadership characteristics are more likely to be attributed to women, right? So if you sort of say, okay, we know we have this skill gap, we know we need women to help fill it, and we also know that at a company level, by having a more diverse workforce, I'm actually going to bring in more of the skills that I need to grow and prosper and flourish. This makes this an economic issue and not necessarily the traditional, it's an HR, it's a nice issue, it's a social responsibility issue. It actually is a bottom line issue. And I think for companies and everyone to understand it, this is part of the reason why this really matters. So, where do we stand and what are the barriers? We're not doing that well, as we started out at the beginning. If you just look globally across countries, on corporate boards, in general, less than, with the exception of Scandinavia, less than 20% participation of women on boards. Norway looks really good. That's because they're legally required to have 1/3 of the board be women. So, but it made a difference, right? It did make a difference. And if you look at management teams in sort of top companies, what you see is that we're still lagging pretty significantly. And some pretty significant countries are looking pretty not so good, right? If you take a look at Germany, take a look at Japan, there's a lot of room for improvement. I'm going to do a sort of tour around the world, and there are slight differences in each of these countries and each of these regions around what it looks like. So if you take Europe, again, this is the sort of the pipeline we talked about, the 53% to 3% in the US. It's only 37%, but it goes down to 2% in Europe. Bringing in a lot fewer women into those entry-level positions. But interestingly, if you start looking at what's the promotion rate, a man is twice as likely to get promoted from entry level to the next level. And by the time you get to the executive team, if you say, we have a woman and a man on the executive team, what's the likelihood that the woman will get chosen versus the man for the CEO position? It's 5 times more likely the man will get chosen, right, in Europe, as we look at that. When we look at what the barriers are and we ask women what the barriers are, There are a range of things that we would expect to be pretty common. Right? First of all, the double burden, the fact that women in general are taking on more of the role at home. They are not only doing their workday, they're taking primary responsibility for the home and for children. And the way that doesn't really correspond with kind of demands on executive level positions, which is anytime, anywhere, I need you 24/7, then you need to be there. It doesn't, those two are not compatible. Also, a set of other common things you would expect: women's reluctance to promote themselves, not a lot of female role models, and women just generally not having a tendency to be as good at networking as men. So there's a lot of things that women can do as well to help put their own positions in what's obviously a system that's not working as well as it could. When we look at Asia, the numbers are a lot more stark. Except for Singapore, Australia, and China, you see just a very, very, very low percentage of women in leadership positions in business. The others are, in line more or less with the rest of the world, but that, again, isn't that good. And what are some of the reasons for that is, a big piece of it is that women's workforce participation is still extremely low in many of the Asian countries, many of the emerging markets, right? Women still are not being brought in. And that's not necessarily a question of education levels, because there are actually, a lot of women are getting educated. There are obviously places where it's not as high as it could be, but it's not purely an education issue. But you're seeing just a lower percentage of workforce participation overall. You're also seeing pretty big attrition. So I think the China example is really interesting. So China does it better than the United States at bringing women in at the entry level, 55%, but the odds of getting to the top are a lot lower, 1% actually make it to CEO. Countries like India are just not even bringing in the women when they need to be brought in, right, at the entry level. Only 30% of the starting workforce is actually female in India. So that's part of the place where the pipeline falls down. And it's important, I think one of the things we've thought is, it's important to understand every place along the pipeline where and how women are being promoted and what does that mean, right? That you need to track the data along the pipeline to understand where the problem is, because the problem in China is not that they're not getting women into the workforce, it's that they're not retaining them, right? In India, they actually have a problem of actually getting women into those roles to start out with, right? There's not enough women to start to even begin to start promoting them. In Asia in particular, something jumps out that's quite different as a barrier, which just is the general lack of pro-family public policies. If you think about the Scandinavian countries, which have year-long maternity leaves, a whole set of daycare programs, things like that, as being kind of the forefront of supporting women in the workforce. Asia doesn't, many of the Asian countries don't have anything that remotely looks like that, and companies don't have the same family-friendly policies. So it's been a very big detractor there. Coming back to the United States, I showed you, gave you the headline news of the pipeline in the US with what we're losing. And I think the real question is why and where? And we did a set of analysis of the pipeline on the Fortune 500 to get the pipeline. But then we went out and we said, let's do some interviews with a variety of companies that are really good at this and who sort of would volunteer to do this. And 66 Fortune 500 companies volunteered and said, hey, we're good at women. We do this right. It's important. It's part of our agenda. What do we do and what do we do well? And so we went and we looked at it and we did some surveys. And we said, let's look across that pipeline and see how you're doing. So women at the entry level, are you at least hitting that average for corporate America of 53% of women coming in the door? And then there are certain companies in technology and stuff where there just aren't actually enough women graduates. So in those companies, we said, okay, we'll give you a hall pass there, but are you at least promoting from entry level to manager at the same level? So if you only have 30% women coming in, are you keeping that 30% as you're going up? The second place we looked is, what's the odds of advancement from a manager level to director, or from a director to director BP levels? What does that look like? And we said, you don't even have to be at par, right? You don't have to have equal promotions, but if you could just get women up at 85% of the rate that you're doing in men, we would consider that pretty good. How do you do there? Then we said, how many women do you have at the top? Do you have basically 1 in 5 people of your executive team are women. 22% are actually in the C-suite and part of that team. And then we said, one of the things we've noticed a lot is that when you look at women executives, they very often are in support roles. They're not in line roles, right? So they're running communications, they're running corporate responsibility, they're running HR, they're running the support roles, but those are not the people who generally get chosen to move into the CEO role because they want you to know that you can run the business. And so are you actually putting women into line roles? And what was amazing is of the 66 companies who all thought they had pretty strong programs on gender diversity, nobody cleared all the hurdles. No one hit it. Only 12 of those companies hit 3 of the 4. Most of them hit 1, 52 of them hit at least one of the dimensions, and a little under half hit 2 or more, right? So even in the companies who are spending the most at this, we still aren't doing the job that we should to attract, retain, and develop women at the level we should. And my sense is, you know, even though we haven't done the research, my guess is that across a bunch of diversity dimensions, you would see probably fairly similar kinds of patterns. And what's interesting is, you know, when we looked at these companies, CEOs often say, and more than 90% of the CEOs said, gender diversity is at the top of my strategic agenda. It's one of the things that I really care about. And when we asked the people in that company, surveyed in the companies we surveyed, more than 4,200 respondents, we said, you know, is gender diversity actually an issue of great importance to the CEO, and is the CEO visibly committed? And less than half of women really thought it was. So there's a lot of sense that there's a disconnect between saying I care about gender diversity and actually acting on it and building the programs and making that visible commitment so that people believe that gender diversity really, really matters. An important thing, as I mentioned before, is this question of what's the role women go into in companies? And this notion of line roles as being important for getting you to the next level, and what does that mean, really matters. So women come in at entry level, and about 2/3 of them are in line roles, right? They're working in the business, and that stays pretty consistent until you start to get to the director level. And then you see a dramatic drop-off. And if you did the same chart for men, what you'd see is that men stay in line roles consistently all the way through their careers. And the likelihood that you'll get promoted from a line role as opposed to a support function is just much, much higher, right? So companies need to be thinking aggressively, you know, are we putting women in those line roles? Are we giving them a responsibility? And are we setting them up for success to actually be running the business, not just supporting the business? So what do we do about this issue? How do we actually grow the number of women in top management? I think we've seen a lot of this in the last couple of weeks with Sheryl Sandberg's book, right, where she started saying, you know, part of it's going to be the companies, part of it's us. How do we actually begin to change the equation? A couple of things that companies need to be doing. So first of all, most companies profess to have gender diversity. You see a real drop-off between having it in theory and having it in practice. So a 50% drop-off between having a program and having a program that works well. A lot of challenge of bringing the commitment from the top down. So 40% of CEOs say they're actively leading something, but when you actually get down to middle management, only about 13% of middle managers say anything in their job has to do with promoting gender diversity. And just a confusion of too many initiatives, keeping inventing, hey, we're going to do this program and this program and this program, and not actually making sure that any of those programs are working and doing well and have sufficient resources and time and staff dedicated to ensure that they're well executed. In Asia, an added problem, which is just not on the corporate agenda for the CEOs in many companies and in senior leadership in many companies in Asia, right? So just getting that recognition onto the agenda, that it actually really matters. And I would be thinking, if I was a CEO sitting in Asia and I was looking at my highly educated workforce that's not getting utilized, I would figure out how I would use women and going after women as a competitive advantage to be able to say, there's an enormously skilled, talented labor pool out there. I have one of the worst labor scarcity issues in terms of getting top talent in the world in many of our Asian countries. what would I do to go open up this talent pool and bring it in? Because I think that's the kind of thing that can be a true competitive advantage for these companies. And if they think about it that way, it might actually change the game altogether. What is it that successful women have in common? You know, when you think about the Sheryl Sandberg lean in idea, what is it that gets some women into those positions? We went out and interviewed more than 200 senior executives, senior women executives, about what was it that made them successful. Many of the things were things you'd expect from any successful executive. First, they work really hard. They care about results. And they're really good team leaders, right? And any senior executive has to be all of those things. A couple of things that popped out that were different for women was just a higher grit and resilience, right? An ability to overcome obstacles and just plow through and get over it, right? You have to be able to have that grit to get through what can be hard things. And also what was really interesting is that the most successful women were ones that asked for feedback constantly. So they took it on themselves and said, hey, how can I get better? And they saw that as part of what their job was continual improvement. And those were women who tended to have, that was a really dominant characteristic in women who've really made it. They also share a lot of characteristics of these women. First of all, many of them were lucky to get something that accelerated their careers early. They got into a position early of leadership, and they were able to build on it. They got these line experience roles that I mentioned before. They had what we call significant sponsorship. So that's different than mentorship, right? Mentor is somebody who will help coach you and help you think about who you are and what you want to be. A sponsor is someone who creates opportunities, right? So most of these women had somebody who was out there saying, I think you should have this job. I think you should have this promotion, right? And they were creating the opportunities for them. A lot of them switched companies, and they saw that they were in one company, and they took advantage of the lift and the opportunity that can come from a job transfer. And I think one of the things that's most interesting about these very, very successful women is that they did actually figure out how to have families, right? So it wasn't they were making a choice between a trade-off between jobs and children and jobs and family. 84% of them chose to have children, and that was directly in line with what you would expect for the population overall, right? It wasn't, many of them have actually figured it out. So it isn't that being successful and being a top executive means that you have to give it up and give up everything in terms of your career. I think many of them are incredibly creative about how they mix and match and make it all work. So in conclusion, 3 priorities for committed leaders. If you think gender diversity is important, you recognize it's important for all of the social responsibility reasons, but also some very, very bottom line economic reasons, there's a set of things that make a difference. First of all, gender diversity is no different than any other strategic agenda item, right? It requires the same set of processes, programs, metrics, performance measurement that any business initiative does, any kind of diversity initiative does. Is not any different than if you said, hey, we're going to go into a new market or a new growth market, or we have a new sales initiative. You have to be data-driven. You have to understand where it makes a difference, what you're doing well and what you're not doing well, and where across that pipeline things are breaking, right? Is your problem that you're not bringing in enough women, or is it that you're not promoting enough women, or is it that you're not putting them into the right roles, or you're not providing the right development and coaching experiences, all of those kinds of things for them. And I think you need to ultimately change the mindset, which is to recognize this isn't a good thing for us to do. It's actually an important and competitive advantage thing for us to do. It actually gives us a distinct competitive advantage by us making sure we're capturing the best ideas and the best talent from all of our workforce, not just from 50%. And with that, thank you very much.